You're looking at what could be nuclear power's last stand in America. The Vogtle nuclear plant in Waynesboro, Georgia, is a sequel to more than a score of other nuclear failures, behind schedule, billions in debt, and passing the bill on to ratepayers.
They promised us power without cost. They gave us cost without power.
This week, the costs and concerns about keeping nuclear plants on the American power grid.
There are over 1,300 toxic Superfund sites in the United States. Today, we go to Montana for a dramatic look at one of the largest and perhaps most beautiful. It's a place where some say a long-awaited cleanup is finally heading in the right direction.
We know the Berkeley pit has a death grip on the groundwater.
This week, we go deep on the Big Dig.
In March, much of the Midwest was underwater. Homeowners relied on payouts from the National Flood Insurance Program.
There are people who right now who have $1 million homes that have subsidies. They don't need that. But there are also people who probably have a $60,000 home who can't afford a few $100s.
We examine a new approach to paying for flood disasters.
Welcome to Full Measure. I'm Sharyl Attkisson. We begin with a hard look at the double-edged sword of the nuclear industry. Right now in the U.S., there are 60 commercially operating nuclear power plants in 30 states. But there's a problem. This clean source of energy comes with a staggering price tag. One after another planned project has run behind schedule and wildly over budget. Today, there's only one nuclear reactor project under construction in the U.S. right now, kept alive by billions in taxpayer dollars. Josie Sturman takes us there to investigate the nuclear option.
Right here.
Every time Steve Prenovitz looks at his monthly power bill, he gets angry.
Pretty much everything has been passed on to the ratepayer. It's a high-stakes game. You know, people getting screwed.
This is the source of his anger. The Vogtle nuclear plant in Waynesboro, Georgia, operated by Georgia Power. Crews nearby are working on Vogtle's 2 new reactors that have become the face of the industry's problems in this country. Reactors 3 and 4 are years behind schedule and more than a jaw-dropping $10 billion over budget so far. A seemingly bottomless pit supported by federal taxpayers and residents like Prenovitz.
Right here. You've got the nuclear construction cost recovery.
His bill includes an extra monthly charge for nuclear construction. For an average family, it adds up to $100 each year.
And what's the danger of passing on the responsibility and the cost to the ratepayer?
Well, danger for who? For the company, no danger. You know, hey, the more they screw up, the more money they make.
The $14 billion budget has swelled to more than $27 billion as problems have stacked up, including inexperienced contractors, construction flaws, and the bankruptcy of its original contractor, Westinghouse. But the troubled Vogtle project has a key source of support.
Why do I believe that this is the best path forward? Because Units 1 and Units 2 that were built in 1987 and 1989 on that very same plant site, they went over budget as well. But now, what is that? It is the cheapest energy in our state, and I believe Vogtle 3 and 4 will be that one day as well.
Tim Echols is vice chairman of the Georgia Public Service Commission, which regulates utilities. Even though its own analysts concluded the project was, quote, no longer economic and suggested it be shut down in 2017, the commission ultimately greenlighted customer fees to keep the project moving.
It would be irresponsible for me to take all of the billions of dollars that have been spent and just throw in the towel because we happen to be running late. No, we're going to push through.
Do you have to keep spending and just continue writing checks just to get this thing done? And is that a wise way to go about this?
You know, I remind them that this elected Public Service Commission will have the final say on what is prudent and what's not prudent. Plant Vogtle's very, very important because if we fail, if we throw in the towel on this, we essentially cede this technology authority to Russia, to China, and to India, which is where the nuclear renaissance is happening right now in the world.
France derives 75% of its energy from nuclear, making it a key component of their power grid. China has 13 new reactors in progress. Russia has more than 20.
But it's still a massive regulatory scheme that these companies have to get through.
Katie Tubbs says the return on America's nuclear investments will be worth it.
The case for nuclear energy is so compelling that I think at some point we'll figure out how to do this right.
Tubb is a policy analyst at the conservative Heritage Foundation. She blames overregulation for the nuclear failures. One analysis says the average nuclear plant must pay nearly $9 million in regulatory costs and $22 million in fees to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission.
I think we have essentially regulated ourselves out of the business of nuclear energy. We've made it very expensive and difficult to run power plants, to innovate.
Meantime, the Vogtle project has now attracted support in the highest of places.
One of the things we want to do at DOE is to make nuclear energy cool again.
Federal Department of Energy Secretary Rick Perry recently offered $4 billion in new loan guarantees to see the Vogtle project through.
The message that gets sent on this plant: America is back in the nuclear energy industry, folks. We are back. We're going to be leading the world.
With all the enthusiasm, Greg Yatsko insists that continuing to fund the Vogtle project is throwing good money after bad.
I was assured repeatedly that these plants would be built on time and on budget.
He once headed the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the powerful federal agency that oversees all nuclear activity in the U.S. He opposed construction of Vogtle 3 and 4.
I mean, imagine giving somebody $15 billion, what they could do with that. Tesla started a car company that is revolutionizing the transportation sector with less money than that. So when you put it in that perspective, it really is a huge amount of money that's just really being wasted.
One notorious nuclear failure is north of Waynesboro at the VC Summer nuclear plant in South Carolina, which also ran over budget and behind schedule. The plant, owned largely by a corporation called SCANA, was supposed to have 2 new reactors online by last year, also paid for by taxpayers and local electric customers.
Significant progress has taken place on the VC Summer nuclear construction site. Indeed, nuclear matters.
In 2017, after 4 years of work, the project was shut down after eating up $9 billion, a quarter of that from electric customers. Those customers sued, and late last year, SCANA agreed to pay them back $2 billion they had been forced to invest into the failed project. From 2007 to 2010, 30 nuclear projects were in design or construction. Every one of them was halted before completion, except Plant Vogtle reactors 3 and 4. Yatsko, the former nuclear regulator, now says it's time for America to face a harsh reality check.
Do you view nuclear power as essential to our power grid at this point, given all the alternatives?
Not at all. I think we have many, many alternatives.
Should we pull the plug on it as a whole?
You know, I think that's a very difficult question to answer. I think the answer is yes. I mean, I think the answer is we should have pulled the plug 5 years ago when it was clear that this project was not going to succeed, or 3 years ago when far less money had been spent.
For now, the future of nuclear power in the U.S. hangs on Waynesboro, Georgia, and the fees paid by people like Steve Prenovitz, keeping Vogel's new reactors on life support. They're now slated to go online in 2021 and 2022, 4 years late.
Okay, you've spent 10 years, which is true. This started in 2009. You spent over $10 billion for the whole project, maybe more, 12 billion, I don't know. How much electricity has Vogtle produced? Not 1 kilowatt hour. None. And then, as one cynic put it this way, they promised us power without cost. They gave us cost without power.
So Georgia Power did not agree to an interview with us, but in an email they said they remain focused on completing these reactors, and once they are done, they should produce enough power for 1 million homes in Georgia.
So why is it that you say that the future of the nuclear industry in the U.S. hinges on this Georgia plant?
Well, without Vogtle, we're left with just the existing nuclear facilities, and they're getting older. As many as 15 of them are going to age out and potentially close down by 2025. Even that is going to cost a ton of money. So without Vogtle, we run out of options.
Really interesting story. Thanks, Josie. Ahead on Full Measure, beautiful but dangerous. We examine one of the country's biggest environmental cleanup projects. There are over 1,300 toxic Superfund sites in the United States, the dirtiest, most complicated, and expensive environmental cleanups in the country. Today, we go to Montana for a dramatic look at one of the largest, where some say a long-awaited cleanup is finally heading in the right direction. Over the past 150 years, the hills in Butte, Montana have yielded hundreds of millions of tons of rock containing valuable copper. At one time, thousands of miners worked here in what was called the richest hill on Earth. This 3D map reveals thousands of miles of now abandoned underground mine tunnels. But a century and a half of mining created an environmental disaster.
This place is uncontaminated area, and there's no doubt about it.
Sister Mary Jo McDonald may be Butte's most recognized environmental activist.
That will be reclaimed the way it should be.
She helped shape plans for the final Superfund cleanup, which is being led and paid for by the company that bought out the polluter.
I think it's a good solution. I do believe they've made a good faith effort, and they have presented to us the possibilities of an area that would be pleasant for some amenities for people to enjoy.
The mile-long, half-mile-wide Berkeley pit is the most visible leftover from Butte's Big Dig. Nearly 1,000 feet deep, the water is laden with metals and chemicals that leach from the rock. So toxic, noisemakers are used to keep birds and animals away. Under the 1980 Superfund law, the worst hazardous material locations in the U.S. were prioritized for long-term cleanup. The pit was declared a Superfund site in 1987. Here, devising the plan to even begin the mandatory cleanup took 8 long years.
Okay, and so it's coming through the highway there.
Sister McDonald successfully pushed for the ambitious solution to filter the hazardous pit water left over from mining. A water treatment plant will soon go online to treat 3 million gallons a day. The filtered water will be released into a mostly dry creek bed. While there's broad agreement on that part of the plan, there's still a lot of arguing over the rest of the cleanup around the pit and in Butte. Over the years, toxic mine residue called tailings were dumped around town. There have been heated negotiations between advocates, residents, and the mine companies over removing the waste and what to build afterwards. There are plans for a system of parks, trails, and a fishing pond.
We're proposing to develop roughly 120 acres of park that will use our stormwater basins as water features. So they'll be set in a naturalized setting. There'll be pedestrian walking trails throughout.
Lauren Burmeister is a manager at a company that inherited the burden of cleanup when it bought out old mine assets.
The response from those public meetings has been overwhelmingly supportive. And I believe it's going to result in a great plan for the city of Butte.
But the plans fall far short of Sister McDonald's goal of restoring Butte to its pristine state seen 150 years ago. As some copper mining continues here, the fixes for the previous mess come with a large price tag. By one estimate, it will cost $1 million a year just to process the pit water. The polluters and those who bought them out pay most of the tab. The federal government pays for some oversight costs. Today, about 350 miners still work on the surface in Butte, but any toxic water is filtered and recycled for use at the mine. Mark Thompson is in charge of environmental issues for Montana Resources, which mines there today.
We know after 30 years of monitoring the groundwater around the Berkeley pit, we know the Berkeley pit has a death grip on the groundwater, and it's all flowing towards the pit. Now it's our turn to show that we can control the pit. I think people are very happy that it's being done sooner than it would otherwise get done.
Sister McDonald says fixing the pit does appear to be on the right track. But more than 30 years after Butte became a Superfund site, she says she'll continue fighting to restore Butte to a more original state
even if others are willing to accept less.
What's going on right now is not acceptable. And if we say yes to this, that's all Butte's going to get. So I'm saying no, and I don't care that 10 others said yes. I'm saying no.
The EPA estimates it'll take at least 5 more years to complete the creek restoration. Cleaning the water from the Berkeley pit will have to continue indefinitely. Coming up on Full Measure, rebuilding mansions for millionaires, the problems with flood insurance, and a possible fix. As the old saying goes, when it rains, it pours. And often the floods that follow are predictably in the same place every time. That means again and again the same home destroyed by flooding may be rebuilt through a national flood insurance program financed by public money. And not so strangely, that program itself is underwater. Lisa Fletcher reports.
In March, much of the Midwest became a disaster zone as floodwaters rushed in, swallowing homes, farms, and businesses. In Iowa alone, damage is estimated at more than $1.6 billion. In the wake of the destruction, residents will rely on payouts from the National Flood Insurance Program. But critics say the program you find at floodsmart.gov is anything but smart. Steve Ellis, with the watchdog Taxpayers for Common Sense, has looked critically at the National Flood Insurance Program for years. Part of the problem, he says, is the National Flood Insurance System provides subsidized coverage on expensive, high-risk homes.
There are people who right now who have $1 million homes that have subsidies. They don't need that. They can still purchase the flood insurance. But there are also people who probably have a $60,000 home who can't afford a few $100s.
FEMA wants to change that. It's announcing an overhaul to re-examine flood risk for individual properties and alter premium prices based on the results. As of now, you're required to buy flood insurance only if you live in a designated flood zone. But the rating methodology hasn't changed since the 1970s, and Ellis says it's in need of a second look.
FEMA's recognized that their mapping is woefully out of date and their mapping technology is woefully out of date. And so they are actually trying to have more advanced maps that have property level data rather than sort of big, broad zones and that actually reflect the level of risk.
FEMA says the new evaluations will take into account a list of factors like types of flooding, how far a home is from the coast, and the cost of rebuilding it. Once it determines who needs insurance, FEMA says it will create a scale of cost, raising premiums for the highest risk places and homes that would be the most expensive to rebuild, and lowering them for lower cost homes.
Does that make sense to you?
It absolutely makes sense. I mean, we shouldn't be overcharging people, and we certainly shouldn't be undercharging people. People should know their relative level of risk.
Part of the goal is discouraging people from repeatedly rebuilding in risky places. Like the single home in Texas that has flooded 22 times since 1979, soaking up $2.5 million in payouts to rebuild.
One of the concerns is people repeatedly rebuilding in risky areas. How would this combat that?
Well, one of the things we need to do is make sure that that we reduce the subsidies, because a lot of these places, if it's only half damage or less than half damage, they can rebuild just exactly the same way in that same spot. And so we want to make sure that if you're going to rebuild these repetitive loss properties, that you're paying full freight under the flood insurance program. And we think that's going to be a really important aspect. So there's both risk communication through mapping, but it's also the price signals that you're sending to people that this is a higher risk area.
It's too soon to know how much rates could change under the new revamped flood insurance program. New insurance premiums are due to be announced in spring of 2020, going into effect October of that year. Even if flood insurance will become more affordable for many, the prospect of higher premiums is drawing pushback, particularly from the states with the most residential flooding. Senator Chuck Schumer of New York is demanding FEMA slow down its overhaul.
So I have a 4-letter message to FEMA. HALT. Halt. Stop. Stop this plan. Let us know what you're doing. Let Congress and homeowners have input, not just insurance companies, not just any of these people who benefit, and we can get things done.
It's never popular with your constituents to see that they're paying higher rates for insurance. The people who see their premiums go up are going to be apoplectic and try to get their lawmakers to step in. And I think we'll have to see exactly how that plays out.
By the way, some in Congress have tried to overhaul the flood insurance program before. In 2017, the House passed a bill to reform it. The Senate didn't act on it. We're back with a look at what's ahead next week, right after this. Next week on Full Measure, one of our favorite programs. We gather some of our correspondents and take a look back at some of our most important and interesting stories of the season. From some of our most interesting interviews with newsmakers to our foreign reports tracking terrorism, and we share some of the stunning places we visited. You've never met President Trump. You've never spoken to him.
Never. Do you believe it's okay for them to go overseas and take up arms against American interests?
Let us be real. People are going to fight back.
She began by comparing charges from two different hospitals for similar knee replacements.
And one came in around $30,000 and the other at $105,000.
Huge difference.
I just kept asking why. Why? Well, the implant was much more expensive. Well, can I see the invoice? Can I see what you paid? No, that's private. You can't see that.
Reflections from our correspondents on our 4th season next week on Full Measure. And we'll answer some of your questions that you've been sending in. Time to take a quick look at some of your comments sent to us on social media. We received some solid feedback on our no pain, no opioid story that profiled a therapist using drug-free alternatives to treat pain. One Facebook user writes, "Opioid gives relief to millions suffering from cancer, burns, torn muscles, back pain, etc. Treating the addictive personality should be considered, not forcing those with chronic pain to go without pain relief." A Twitter user responded to our cover story and poll on trust in the media, saying there is literally no question of trust in the media. The media is a pure propaganda arm of the cabal. And finally, as a response to a recent show, another Facebook user says, "Used to love your show. With the far-right Trump apologist Sinclair broadcasting version, you have become unwatchable." Thanks to those of you who've stuck with us anyway. We look forward to hearing more from you soon. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and let us know what you think. There's a new way you can watch Full Measure on our new streaming service, Stir. You can download the app on your phone. It's also available on Roku, Apple TV, and Fire. Now you can watch Full Measure anytime, anywhere on Stir. Until next week, thanks for watching. We'll be searching for more stories that hold powers accountable.